Hi, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I took out some stencils and decided to play around with a few different techniques. The first, I'm using the Magic and Wonder Magical Plaid stencil by Echo Park, and I'm using 80-pound Nina Solar White cardstock. I started by laying down a light coat of Distress Oxides in the color Peacock Feathers and Worn Lipstick. I didn't really blend them too well, I just kind of laid down my base color. It will look a bit messy in the beginning because they're not blended, and I know Distress Oxides stay wet a little bit longer, even to the touch, more than regular Distress inks. Once I had my base color down, I went ahead and adhered my cardstock to my stencil using Post-it tape. I use the Post-it tape on the back of the cardstock so that I don't get those harsh lines. I went ahead and added another layer of the Distress Oxides right over the same color that I had already put down as my base coat. And that's it for that one. For the next one, I'm also doing a bit of ink blending as well. I'm using the Prairie Floral Stencil by Cartabella, also on 80-pound Nina Solar White cardstock. And I'm using Blueprint Sketch regular Distress ink. I stuck my cardstock onto the stencil the same way as I did with the first technique. And this stencil is a little bit more intricate, so I went ahead and pounced on the color instead of rubbing it on as you would do with ink blending. Once my ink was laid down, I decided to add a little bit of texture. So I'm going to emboss this in my Gemini. Depending on what die cutting machine you use, the sandwich may be a little bit different. But for the Gemini, I typically use the first cutting plate, the rubber bat, the plastic shim, and then the second cutting plate on top, and I run that through my machine. The third technique I'm doing involves heat embossing. I'll be using the Climbing Vine stencil by the Crafter's Workshop, along with the Rose Gold embossing powder by Lawn Fawn. Before sticking my stencil onto the cardstock, I went ahead and treated that with an anti-static pad. Next, I took my Versamark and I just pounced that over the entire panel of the cardstock. Once that was fully covered, I went ahead and added my embossing powder and heat set that. I ended up with a few areas that didn't really have that great of coverage, so I used an Emboss It pen by Ranger to fill in those areas and add a bit more embossing powder. Next, I'm using the Geometric Circles stencil by Neat and Tangled, and I'm working on my Ranger craft mat because I will be using some texture paste. I actually found this technique out by accident when I failed to clean my stencil properly before using it the next time, and I thought it gave a really nice effect. I'm using the Hybrid inks by Simon Says Stamp in the color Hollyhock, and I'm just pouncing that over the entire stencil. Once my stencil was covered with the ink, I went ahead and adhered that on top of my panel this time so that I didn't smear that ink. I just stuck the Post-it tape right to the Ranger craft mat and just on the tops and sides of the stencil. The texture paste seems to be a little thicker than regular embossing powder, so before I add that to my card panel, I typically put just a little bit on my craft mat and work that out a little bit to thin it out. You want to make sure that you don't work the texture paste too much. You want to pick up some of that ink, but if you work it too much, you'll lose the effect. You kind of see a little bit of a swirling effect with that ink and the texture paste, and you don't want to lose that. So you want to smooth that out as quickly as possible. Once that's done, you want to make sure that you clean your stencil immediately because it will dry on there. And I just set that panel aside to dry. For the last technique, I'm using the Glorious Petal Stencil by Hero Arts, and I'll be using texture paste again, so I continued working on my Ranger craft mat. I'll go ahead and tape this down to the back of the stencil like I did with the first 3 techniques because I'm not using any ink. Now we've all probably used ink and re-inkers to color our texture paste and embossing paste, but this time I didn't necessarily want to change the color, but I did want to change the texture and the look of just plain white texture paste. So I found this glitter at, I believe it was Michael's in the clearance section. So I picked it up and I've had it for a while and I've never really used it, but I decided to try to mix that with the texture paste to see what effect that I would get. Once that panel was done, I went ahead and put that off to the side to dry and clean my stencil. I decided to keep these cards pretty simple and just added sentiments from the Thanks stamp set by Simon Says Stamp. And that was it. Thanks so much for stopping by.